what was happening after 1600. Now the prize, the economic prize of the Europeans, the Caribbean islands, North and South America, is beginning to yield enough economic gains to start competition among the European powers for space in the New World. Remember, all of the North American continent is not the United States. So there's competition among European powers, not only for space on the North American continent, there's competition among some European powers for space in what is now the United States. In the United States wasn't settled solely by English. Spanish settlement in Florida, they were pushed out. Then the French settlement that we talk about the consequences of later on. And there's competition for space in the lucrative Caribbean islands between England, and there's competition in Africa itself for who will control what part. And the British having the greatest amount of muscle is beginning to push the lesser powers around, especially the Scandinavians, who are a long way from home, and that whose supply line is so thin and so far away from home, they're in a poor position to defend themselves. But a comparatively little people, little and numerically, but shrewd in the colonial game and one of the most ruthless slave traders in the business of the Dutch. These wooden shoe wearing people, these tulip growing people, these people whose homes are so clean they were named a place after them, was one of the great spillers of blood in the slave trade. And if you want to read a book that is an absolute revelation in the conduct of the slave trade and under different colonial powers, read Sir Harry Johnson's The Negro in the New World, and read his chapter on the Africans under the Dutch. Read the whole book. Read the whole book because the whole book is worth reading. See, one thing, and that has caused a lot of students to rob themselves of a lot of information. Now, they would just slap the name colonial trigger on Sir Harry Johnson. See, the white supremacists in the colonial trigger. And factually, they would be right. But if you miss reading Sir Harry Johnson, you have missed some major information. This white supremacist and this colonial digger was a master researcher, and he could write well. His analysis, or almost a catalog of what slaves were brought to the New World, what slaves they were advised not to have brought at all. The fighting tribes, the tribes who came, pretended peacefulness until they kind of got the lay of the land and fought later. Those who had to watch. See, watch those Europeans, you know, they'll hang around for years until they see an opening. And they don't never fight at once. But that means that the cans of wine, sometimes he hits you right away. The Europeans will pretend meekness until he catch you off guard. He outlined the fighting spirit of different ones at different places. And different ones, it was advisable not to have war at all. Orlando Patterson, Jamaican sociologist, now at Harvard, went over some of the same material, drawing different conclusions in his book, The Sociology of Slavery. And Madoff attempted to bring this up to date in his last book, The Social Death of Slavery. But Sir Harry Johnson, supposed to have been that Englishman who knew more about Africans than any man alive. Now, while that wasn't so, it's an exaggeration and an overstatement of his talent. The one thing that he did know, he knew how to catalog the categories of Africans brought into the Americas and in the Caribbean islands in such a way that you could study the temperament, almost the temperature of their culture. That's Sir Harry Johnson. But he also wrote another work that you would deprive yourself of a whole lot of information by not reading. The Colonization of Africa by Alien Races. By Alien Races. Now, but the book, the main book, which I have extracted a lot of information, which deals with what I'm talking about tonight, is really the Negro in the New World and the impact of Africans in the economic making of the New World, and different colonial powers trying to deal with these different temperaments of Africans and these different plantation systems, and the plantation system as a separate cultural way of life or non-cultural way of life, but as a separate way of life that Gilberto Freire, the Brazilian historian, has said, called a separate civilization. In his work, masterpieces except for his concept of the Nile slave trade. See, if you can live through his concept of the Nile slave trade and read the masters and slaves and the shanties and the mentions and other works by Gilberto Freire, so if you can live through that, the fact that there was no such thing as a Nile slave trade, he assumed that there was. He assumed that the mulatto woman in Brazil was as close to heaven as women got on earth, because many times the mulatto women in Brazil, after the arrival of the white woman, were treated even better. That means he don't know what better consists of. She was the prize as the concubine, the mistress, but nobody married. All the rich planters had one. It was the style of the day to have one, and to have one in a house with, sometimes with servants. She had a carriage, but she had no legal status. She couldn't make any demands on anyone. If a master died, she couldn't demand any portion of his property. But his legal wife, who tolerated in his relationship with her, when he died, she got the plantation. But the mistress got nothing except for he had given her in his lifetime. But Gilberto Freire is of the opinion that this woman rose higher in the societies of Brazil. It might well have been the make of Brazilian society, and the epitome of Brazilian society. Because many times these planters come to the ball and introduce their mistresses before they introduce their wives. They did the same thing in New Orleans. Even had balls, Creole opera room balls, where they would dress and parade their concubine mistresses, mixed breeds. Even sent to Paris a special dress for them. So the whole opera room society. This is the origin of the Louisiana Creole. Ourselves did not worth a great deal here and now, but it was a separate society, so separate from blacks that it was a long time, even up to the present, many wouldn't go to school with blacks. You couldn't go to school with whites. It presented an educational dilemma for the school system. Now, what we're dealing with now not only the competition between these colonial powers, we're dealing with the making of the New World structurally, the remaking of a people psychologically and physically. And when you talk about slavery and the Africans in the world, no one talks about the fact that here is African people, that in order to manage them, they had not only to break the will of so many of them, they had to bastardize them in large numbers and turn the bastards against certain factions and create fear and suspicion one against the other in order to weaken the concept of revolution and use one to spy on the other. Now this was effective in the West Indies and effective in parts of South America. This same system was not effective in the United States. Because in the United States, the crude slave master, who still crude in the same way, put all the color gradations in one bag, shook them up, and put one name on the bag. You know what the name is, so you can't repeat it. So the lightest of the lights, the almost whites, if they were poor, stood next door to the blackest of the blacks. In the United States. But in other places, they got the same privileges. I'm not saying they didn't get privileges in the United States, but they got a different kind of privilege. They got privileges in colleges, they got privileges in the fraternities and the sororities and the local societies. But such privileges that they got in Brazil, and such privileges they got in Jamaica, almost a separate society, separate neighborhood, separate job categories, privileges they got in rural Haiti to this very day. They didn't get that kind of privilege in the United States. And yet, when the United States occupied Haiti, the United States played on that scenario left by the French to rule Haiti, the period of American colonialism in Haiti. You got to go back to America occupied Haiti by 1915, it didn't lead to 1934. And that America ruled the country for putting these gradations of color once again, one against the other, far more ruthlessly than they've ever done here in the United States. So in the United States, America does not care too much about putting color that they have. Mentioned, the business is similar to light-skinned one, it's the white one. So long as one declared one. Now, we're talking about the making and remaking of the people group. The main thing we're talking about is economic competition between European powers for space that will yield them the profit to rebuild and strengthen the economy of Europe and lay the foundation for the modern world. And that the plantation system could not have been built in Europe because Europe hadn't got the land. And if Europe had the labor could not have been used quite that way. Because the labor used in the fuel system of Europe was not as productive as the labor used in the plantation system of the New World. And the Europeans did try to enslave Europeans and did bring Europeans to the New World in large numbers and work them without any appreciable success. But in the United States, they had more success with the variation of work because of the variation of climate. Now I'm coming to 1619 because we're dealing with the 1600s in the aftermath. Because 1619, when Africans arrived in the United States, brought to the United States, they found that the larger number of indentured servants were white, and some were Indian. And the whites were mostly Irish, some Central European, but mostly Irish. Poor Europeans, some Scandinavians, who did not have the price of paying their way to the U.S. and who got on boats and who, for the price of passage, the captain had the option of auctioning their labor off. So the people who were purchasing their labor literally had to pay the passage. We had to work for that person for a little year to pay off the passage. These were indentured services as against chattel slaves. And that when they arrived and the Africans began to commingle with them, and there was no objection to relationships one to the other, which tells us something which a whole lot of bigots in this country would like to forget. That the whole concept of prejudice and separation based on color had a hard time getting started in this country. Because it didn't make sense to people of the same class in the same predicament who had the same enemy and the same oppressor. So it didn't make sense for them to fight against each other or separate themselves from each other, having the same common oppressor and the same common enemy. Now, in the West Indies, a similar thing happened. Then in Barbados, that some descendants of the poor Irish, called Johnny Redlegs, still in Barbados. And why they didn't make much out of themselves, I'll never know. But if you ever saw a group of white people that you wanted to kind of sympathize with, well, I don't know why they didn't put themselves up by their bootstraps and who stole their boots. Probably didn't have any boots. But the Johnny Redlegs of Barbados are the most pathetic. You don't see it all your life. You feel like making a contribution to it was called. And a few times the Barbadian ladies married Johnny Redlegs, they did a shake your head to a poor person, you know better. And I'll be committed. Because these were poor guys who didn't work their way up to nothing. And whose descendants in Barbados to this day are still depressed and still poor. While in America, the poor whites did work their way out of it, did work their way up to something. Many of the Irish became slave drivers, managers, petty something or another. Anyway, they did work their way out of their predicament. But in the West Indies, a lot of the poor English overused that privilege, drank too much, gambled too much, now with access to more women than they ever had in their life, not in a position to resist. Some of them took of that temptation too much. Some of them could have told them, you might as well try to drink all the water in the sea. They didn't know that. And the passing of that group of petty craftsmen from England brought over to fix things on the plantation, basic mechanics. The passing of that group brought into being some skilled slave laborers, blacksmiths, wagon masters, people who would fix the machinery on the sugar plantation. This is the origin of the Caribbean freeman. Because that American freeman would come into being about the same time and about the same way, but not exactly for the same reasons. The slaves in New England were not used the year round. The winters were long, there wasn't enough for him to do the year round, so he became an industrial slave. Those who weren't working in industry, worked in carpentry, developed a paying skill. The master generally rented them out If a slave was a good carpenter, he could make $4 a day. So the master would bring him out. He would take 3. Let him have one of them. So a slave sometimes he could make enough money to buy his own freedom in a year. Maybe save his dollar, few dollars, then, and he could purchase his freedom because of the pressure of the Quaker. Because the Quakers were propagating against slavery anyway. And so that moral pressure made it a little easier to purchase. And sometimes the Quakers gave him the additional money he would need to purchase his freedom. So now you've got Caribbean free men, Black American free men. In South America, you've got free men, the relatives of the black woman who married the Portuguese, and the church agreed that once she married the Portuguese, she is free. And some of her relatives became free, used as laborers in the hinterlands of Brazil, and some of them escaped, were free by virtue of escape. Now, you've got a class of Africans in South America, in the West Indies, and the U.S. we're going to have to deal with later on, because they're going to be thinkers. In Brazil, out of this class will come 2 emperors, Pedro I, Pedro II, mixed breed rulers of Brazil. Out of it will also come the father of Brazilian literature, Emmanuel Dias. And from Peru, another part of South Africa, will come the first, maybe the only saint of African descent canonized in the New World, Father Martin de Porres. So now you see the results of, now I'm not praising the mixing, I'm not judging the mixing, I'm not saying it was good or bad. I'm saying that out of it came certain personalities who would play a role in changing the status of Africans in the New World. All of this was happening, which meant nothing of a consequence to the colonial powers fighting for space, competing with each other for space in Africa and in the Caribbean islands. The greatest producer of net economic gain other than Africa. Africa's production of net economic gain would be the slave itself. The Caribbean producer of net economic gain would be the product from the plantation system that is now beginning to feed Europe and begin to profit from it. Now, sugar is beginning to be a marketable product. The leather from the cows, etc. The mahogany, Jamaica once had a large mahogany forest. It's been mutilated to the point now, but Jamaica has a law against cutting mahogany. And the law will stay intact for 20 years to give the trees a chance to grow back. But Brazil still has a large mahogany forest. We don't have it long because the Americans are there now cutting like food, not planting nothing. Haiti once had a large mahogany forest. But the diversity of wood that Europeans needed furniture. And the British brought over a lot of furniture from England. And the termites in the New World just ate that furniture for dessert. The wood was so soft, they just smacked their lips on that. And so the Africans had to take local wood and reproduce that furniture because the termites just having a holiday eating up that soft wood. And if you go to Jamaica today, you will see some of the furniture. They made replicas of the British furniture who came over. Now I go into a home in Jamaica, someone pointed to a bed. My great-grandfather was born on that bed. My father was born on that bed. I was born on that bed. And you could put a truck on the bed. It was so strong. Good mahogany. Mahogany is leg, mahogany side, mahogany everything. But Jamaica had plenty of good mahogany at the time, just before they cut it down so fast until today you can't cut mahogany at all in Jamaica. You're talking about African craftsmen now working and reproducing, producing replicas of great furniture. We're not talking about raw labor. We're talking about skilled craftsmen. Many of these Africans were skilled craftsmen, woodworkers, before they were captured as slaves. In fact, that too many people overlook. They think this is brought from wrong people running words nobody could understand. To the New World came a whole lot of skillful people, including iron workers, who revolutionized the iron works. A lot of youth iron work in New Orleans, mostly grill work, fences, and the fine iron work on the porches in New Orleans. A lot of it being taken down, and some of it being preserved for museums. Now all this is happening outside of Africa. So within Africa itself, there's resistance and the continuation of slavery. Africa is still being drained of slaves. The Portuguese, having fought in Zinga, and in Zinga, having fought and lost, they're taking over Angola. Remember now, you got two Portuguese slave trades. One takes care of Lisbon, regular Portuguese. The other slave trade is taking care of the needs of Brazil, where you have a group of Portuguese who pulled away from the mother country and who need slaves for the Brazilian market as against the general Portuguese market. Now the Portuguese, who's taking slaves from the East Coast in partnership with the Arabs, they are selling and reselling. They are dumping some of their slaves into the British market, a lot to the Arab markets going to the east. Now, if you understand the early Arab slave trade, starting in the 600s, but you got to go even further back. If you understand that Hatshepsut started a relationship between Asia, China, India, then I think called Canada, 1500 BC, and this is all documented with information on the items that the Chinese took out of Africa and information on what the Africans bought from the Chinese. And that is a little book on the last phase of this trade called The Papyrus of the Algerian Sea, written by Greek gazetteer. And this tells you what was for sale all down the coast of East Africa, the Red Sea ports of the Chinese, all along this coast. Now, when you go to a book like Anacalypsis and read about African-looking, dark-skinned emperors on the throne of China, now it will make a little sense. Now, how they got there, I don't know. Began to be taken to China and India during that period. So now, but that's not what I'm really talking about. I'm trying to get to after 1600 and the competition between European and European that's going to lead to a change in the method of trading that's going to be really a preface to another form of slavery that we have to deal with. And that's going to be colonialism. Because chattel slavery itself is going to become top-heavy. And the change is going to come not because anybody loves anybody. It's going to come because it's going to reach a saturation point. It's going to reach a point where everybody's going to have one who wanted one, could afford one, and then the British will start the campaign to get rid of the traffic at sea. from the British abolitionists, Wilberforce, Granville Shaw, who kept a quick reputation, fighting to end the slave trade. The people think they're humanitarians, and they're not, because neither one of them fought against child labor in England. Neither one of them fought against the abuse of women in England. Neither one of them fought against the fact that women were picked up off the street and then they brought to America to be auctioned off to the men in America who, because of an oversupply of men and a shortage of women. And in the Western movement, most of the men, when there was an extreme shortage of women, they were brought to the early trade movement to the West, when it was just brought for that purpose, to be the rise of the mates of those men at the end of the trade job, and at the end of the trade, the cattle drive traders, and literally auction off, just like you auction off products in a bit. Once the story of the United States is told, once the story of servitude is told, and once the story of what happened to the female in America, black, white, and otherwise, I think you're going to have a women's real movement that might make a whole lot of people run for cover. Because her deal has been rather sad. But be that as it may, what we're trying to get to is that competition between these slaveholders. And we look at slavery as a labor system is now making them reconsider the structure of the system. And the rebellions are costing so much that to a great extent it is not worth it. Brazil generally left out of the history of rebellions. Brazil, more than Haiti, gave the greatest example of African self-assertion and state building in the New World, in bringing into being the Colombos, the African independent communities in the New World, after and in and around the Republic of Palmares, almost 100 years before the American Revolution. Bahia would not last as long, and its fight, though heroic, would not be as heroic. But that too came before the American Revolution. But at the tip end of South America, another series of revolts that Wentworth Higgins called the British Negro revolts. And the best known to the longest fought of these revolts, coming again before the American Revolution, is the Bubbies Revolt, the Dumbarton River, what is now Guyana, formerly British Guyana. Here you have a slave revolt when a house slave, Kofi, saw his wife, a field slave, beaten to death, and held his position, held his peace, and this act so affected him that he saw the true tragic nature of slavery and set a revolt in motion along with another field servant named Uncle. Here is the first time you see a slave revolt where a field servant and a house servant is working hand in hand. Although they argued a lot, they did work together. And Kofi would set this revolt in motion, and almost in a show of vengeance, against what he let happen to his wife, he married again an escaped slave from one of the plantations, a woman who was a field slave who escaped, and wrote her master and say, come and get her and prepare to spill blood, because I will not yield. And each time he wrote his former master, who kept asking him to yield, to give up the land that he had taken, he would write them back, stating he would not, but sign all of his letters, never again to be a slave. This revolt was against the Dutch, and it lasted so long, the Dutch could get communications to Holland. The whites, the local whites, had yielded and begged for mercy. And he wasn't defeated until communications came, heavy ammunition and soldiers. The revolt lasted for almost 3 years. Finally, defeat, but when you think of the time of this revolt and the success that he had, in spite of the lack of modern ammunition, modern equipment of any kind, and that people would write the history of revolution and would leave this aspect completely out of history. Now, while this revolt at the tip end of South America, the revolt in Suriname, known as the Bush Negro Revolt, and the revolt in Guyana, or the Baptiste Revolt, would be the best known. One of the oldest ones in South America, the revolts in Venezuela, other parts of South America. In fact, there's a whole book on the Venezuelan abolitionist movement. Then there's excellent research on the Brazilian abolitionist movement. But if you think that even this plastic, this cosmetic change, and I'm going to tell you now that what you call emancipation was a cosmetic change in the slave system before converting it into colonialism. But if you think even this cosmetic change came about out of the goodness of anyone's heart, then you're misreading history. That change came about because African men, African women stood up and opposed that system for over 100 years physically, and in some cases destroyed it, and threatened the entire plantation system, which was the very economy of Europe. Outside of Europe, they had built an economy feeding and contributing to the recovery of Europe. All of this was threatened by the self-assertion of these Africans. And they had to make a move. And they went through the motions of liberation with a fakery called emancipation. But they would convert this into another form of slavery called colonialism that was more manageable. So the change after 1600 would be only a cosmetic change to turn down revolts. It turned down revolts, but it did not stop revolts. But that was like the preface to today's revolts. These and the larger, the more meaningful and more political revolts that would come in the 19th century. But there's some more work to be done in explaining the 18th century and the personalities, black, white, and otherwise, that led up and that participated in the 18th century, because the 18th century was the century of monumental black abolitionists, some true white abolitionists, and when a reading and writing class had emerged in the West Indies, in the United States, and in Africa itself, are now a little freer and are now making more demands that mother demand in that position is also a part of Western social thought. All of these things now will come together in the 18th, which will lead to the 19th, which I would consider the fighting century for African people all over the world. And I have often called the greatest century of African people outside of Africa. The century that we have to live again in order to understand the 20th and make the 21st. Because until we understand that 19, we will not understand that in the 20th century, we actually slowed down. And we don't make the 2030s. We don't really have to go back and study the men and the women of the 19th. And over the last week, I've been focusing on how you want to look at them, how you want to take them, what time, and whether you understand the environment and the conditions that shaped each one and made each one the way he was, given the circumstances and the time that their life unfolded. And remember, Du Bois lived almost a century himself, and he spanned so many ages, and he rode the tide of those ages. He rode it exceptionally well, making changes with it, like a man riding a tiger, keeping his original strength, and reaching out for the wisdom of age all at the same time. He was the intellectual master. And we have to go back to that well and drink the pure water of intelligence and understand that. But don't ever put one over the other. Don't ever prefer one to the other. But take each one based on his individual contribution. And remember, each one of those men was saying the same thing, but using different words based on how environment and condition shaped them to do and say what they did. But we will get to the 19th, because maybe the greatest thing the 19th did was to be the antecedents of those men in the 20th century. Everything relates to everything, and all history is connected one way or the other. That's going a little too far ahead, because we just finished the 16th, going into the 17th, because the 17th century and the 18th century might have been the most tragic and difficult century for the slave trade and the slaves. Because out of it would produce a caliber of research that would make the slave traders reassess and reconsider their position. And this reconsideration would lead to this fakery called emancipation. And this fakery, in turn, would lead to another managerial system, which they call colonialism. And we haven't finished with colonialism to this day. That the Europeans were always searching for a managerial system that would make it possible for them to extract labor, goods, and services from a large number of people, to keep grist constantly feeding into his mills at a reasonable or at a very cheap cost. When he has to pay reasonable prices for all of this, he will have to readjust his economic system altogether. And this he don't intend to do. So now, if I keep on talking, you will understand the stubbornness to yield South Africa. Maybe the people of Bolivia want to know why Western dominance of the tin mines. The Mexican might bring up the question of the oil again. And this is going to lead to an international question once South Africa goes, because the best developed method of extracting and using the mineral wealth of Africa has been developed in South Africa. And most of these methods go into Western industry. And without them, Western industry would have to change its whole method. And if they ever have to pay for it, pay top price for it, for them to get it from the cheap price that they're now getting it, they would have to make a drastic economic change. So Western nations in general, left or right, do not really want South Africa to fall. This might surprise you. This might also include socialist nations. Europe is Europe. And do not think racism stops at the door of communism and socialism. Unless you've got illusions. Racism is racism. Europe is Europe. They are clear about it. If there's any confusion, it's your confusion. Any illusion, it's your illusion. They are clear about what they want. They want to dominate the world forever. You got confused about partnership and united, humanity. You got that dream of Christian brotherhood and Martin Luther King. Judeo-Christian, I think he said it so beautiful. You didn't even think he believed it. But you got to believe it. Nobody, who else do you see propagating it? Anybody other than King propagating it?
Jesse Jackson.
No, I mean, other than us in company. Judeo-Christian ethic. The Judeo-Christian ethic, they got us into the slave trade. They were the ones who wrote that chapter. All right, Pete. That's enough. We should have some discussion about it now. I'll use up the time anyway.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes.
All right, then let's use 5 minutes.
I have a question. When black free men from the Caribbean entered the stage of becoming blacksmiths, etc., were they able at times to escape if they wanted to do that at all towards the United States?
They not only did, but they came in some numbers, came to the United States and settled. Some started organizations. One edited a newspaper. One started a lodge, the Black Masonic Order. He called it the African Lodge at Prince Hall, Barbados. Louvain Bennett's book, Pioneers of Protest. It's a very good portrait of Prince Hall. There's a new book on it by Charles Wesley, but it's hard to get. And some of my academic friends visit my house, and I don't know what kind of pockets they got, but the book left with one of them. Charles Wesley's wife, Dr. Toto got to be a very good friend of mine. He's got me a second copy. I just hid that one. So when they come, that one's under something. But there is a good book on there's Peter Ogden from Antigua who started the Arch Fellows. I mean, a lot of them came to the U.S. The Caribbean miners had some of his finest flowering away from home and in the United States. One of the great unsung heroes of the Caribbean, and most Caribbeans don't even know about this, is Hubert Harrison. Rather finished high school. First he taught at Columbia University and Henry George School. And Columbia University didn't want to admit that an unlettered street speaker from Harlem was teaching, so they put him down as handyman and paid him as a handyman. But he was teaching in Columbia economics and all kinds of subjects. He paid as a handyman. Those several books, one from Africa Awakens, we're reading right now. As far ahead of his thinking, as far ahead of some of the people who he died by 1947. Hubert Harrison, he had demanded to introduce Marcus Garvey to his first large audience.
I thought the book last week you started to lay out the approaches of the free men of the 19th century. You studied Washington, Dolores, and Garvey. You talked about one of them. So you talked about other two. You talked both reading of Washington. This approach to it.
You know, See, Washington, I was briefly Washington, concept was to feed yourself, house yourself, and clothe yourself, and sustain yourself. And Du Bois' concept was to protect yourself politically, and that an education is supposed to make you aspire to be anything from a good street sweeper to the president. And Garvey's concept was the reclamation of Africa, the unification of African people, and the redemption of Africa throughout the whole world. And all of them thought of nation management and preparation for nation management. They were all dreamers along different lines, and they were all saying the same thing. Only Garvey put it in more graphic words at the end of the Lord of one of his speeches. Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. He was a great one building confidence, and he understood something which so many people do not understand to this day. That to oppress a people, you must first destroy their self-confidence and historical memory. And they forget what they have been, they're confused about what they are, and they're not too clear about what they still have to be. And you don't have to go to the prisons for them, really, because you got them in one, psychologically. More binding than any war can possibly hold you.
Isn't that the concept of, isn't that the theory behind colonialism?
That is the theory of colonialism. Yeah. Not only behind colonialism, it is the theory of colonialism. Make you think you're nothing but a nothing. The first thing to make you laugh at they laugh at your gods. The next achievement is to make you laugh at your gods. Then you change gods, take their gods, their dress, their food taste, and what else do they need from you? You're a total trap. You got their gods, their image, sipping tea at 4. You never taste tea, your damn life don't like tea. Yeah, because they sip it at 4, you sip it at 4. They don't need to be in the prisons after that. I've seen Africans and all that climate with tweed on. Can you imagine like going around in Africa with tweed and a tie? Or going to school with bobtail coat and a wing collar just because the English did that in England? Who gets a prison after that? He got the mind. John Dubé, a great South African, that was his relative who had the problem in Senegal. A lot of people try to forget that that was the relative of the great John Dubé who really built the ANC originally. People don't study enough history. That was the grand nephew of John Dubé.
They didn't grant his tenure.
Huh?
They didn't grant his tenure.
And he didn't do much. He just said the time was easy.
Was he lying?
No.
Did the English-speaking world have parliamentary democracy prior to embarking on colonialism, or was it hand in hand? The parliamentary system in England and France, that was in place prior to the big years of the slave trade, wasn't it?
It tended to be in concurrent with what that means. Having parliamentary democracy at home and behaving in a different way away from home is no contradiction for them, because the people away from home are not considered human beings anyway.
Is that the sole rationale, the subhumanity of others?
Well, it's not the sole rationale, but it is the fact that they have not, in that mentality, elevated the people to the point of thinking that the people deserve equal consideration with them on a human level, or that the people are capable of handling the parliamentary system.
It's the greed that justifies the labeling of subhuman, the
Yeah.
desire to exploit,
Yeah.
is rationalized by the label of subhuman,
Yeah.
and backed up by Christian theology.
It's not backed up by Christian theology.
significance now in dealing with fact of history, with this fact of history. And the reason why the course starts at 1600s, because after 1600s, there are no jagged edges in European history, or African history, or Asian history. There are certain things now in place. They are tragic, but they are now in place. Europe is coming clearly out of the Middle Ages. Europe is getting to its feet. Europe is clearly back in command of the Mediterranean, the pinnacle seat of the commercial ancient world. Europe is back in control of the major commercial areas that set in motion the Roman Empire, and that without which there would have been no Roman Empire. For 1,000 years, one way or the other, one form of Eastern power and African power has either frustrated or stayed the hand of Europe. The Crusades are over. The famines and the plagues of Europe are over, but the scars are still there. The conflict within the church is still there, but the method of dealing with the conflict is intact. Feudalism has been modified, but feudalism is still intact in Russia and in other parts of Europe. But it is obvious that feudalism will have to give way to something a little more humane than what the young lords conceded to the serfs during the Crusades, which was the right of first night. Now briefly, as we explained before, during the absence of the old laws during the Crusades, and the old laws had established literally the right for someone married on their land, the right of sleeping with the bride the first night, a right that the lords had. The young lords had given up that right without their permission during their absence. Now, this sounds so totally insignificant. It sounds cruel that they would have assumed this right in the first place. But what you have to understand, that the European dehumanization of the rest of the world had started with the European dehumanization of the Europeans. And that the mentality, literally the rehearsal of the European taking over vast areas of the world and treating people as less than human, had started in Europe, with Europeans treating Europeans as less than human and denying them their basic rights. And when the Europeans, including many who came to the United States, crying about persecution, it was an argument, a class argument between certain European classes and religious groups, arguing about a clash of differences between religious groups. William Penn and his group and the Quakers and all these people escaping England, coming to America to escape persecution, none of them had voiced a vested interest in child labor in England, in the real persecution in England. They were talking about the Church of England being against these various groups that had left the Church of England and established a religion in variation and sometimes contrary to that of the Church of England. When they said persecution, it was a difference of opinion between classes of people, sometimes the same class but of a different religion. And we keep forgetting that sometimes people are not talking about working class people at all. Because in this country, and this is still true, although a whole lot of people find it difficult to get through that regular thing is, this country was fashioned originally for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. That's what America was originally designed for, and that's who still is the privileged class in the United States. And when they said liberty and justice for all, that was the all. And we quite forget that the white woman got the vote day before yesterday. And that the white woman's suffrage, including the leading one, Susan B. Anthony, when she and the suffragettes had tried everything to get the vote. But finally, they got the vote. She said, and this struck home, in a nation where none like women can vote, some like men can vote. Then they considered giving the vote. A class struggle unfolds in Europe over and above the class struggle outlined by Karl Marx, and one unfolds in the United States over and above the one outlined by Karl Marx. So what is at issue now, and what was at issue in the 1600s, was not a fight for anybody's freedom at all, but the freedom of a given class to exercise its authority over the lower classes. This is why you are confused with Russia and the United States. The assumption is that one of the giants is on the side of the working class. I have no compunction in admitting that the worker of Cuba, China, and the Soviet Union is far better off than he was before the revolutionary change in that country, and would be worse off under capitalist U.S. That's no big admission. But when the United States and Russia, when the leaders meet, they are not discussing that. They are discussing power. And when they talk about us, if they talk about us at all, meaning African people, if they discuss African people at all, the discussion is who will rule over them. Now, in the 1600s, the question of slavery is settled. It is a foregone conclusion that all Europeans are for it. But the question is, which one of them will have what part of the pie? Now, Portugal and Spain had led in the business because the Portuguese had been more skillful at papal politics, the politics of the Catholic Church, because the Portuguese are a small nation lacking in manpower, but not lacking the skillful use of such manpower as is God. The Portuguese had extended themselves beyond their capacity to govern. They had already established such enclaves in Asia, even on the shores of India. And the Portuguese, seeing the Spaniards getting a large hunk of land and feeling themselves out of things, a little too much out of it, and not too clear about the lines of demarcation laid down by the poet when he had said, if you take the east and you take the west and you two good kind of nations start fighting among yourselves. Not too clear about who's going to take the east and who's going to take the west. Now you have to understand what I'm talking about. The Pope divided into the world. So in Portugal, you take one half, and in Spain, you take the other half. I know it tasks the imagination, but this is what happened. And you was ambiguous. So nobody goes up, go back to the center, your grace, what side am I supposed to take? So the assumption was that the Spaniards would take the west, the Portuguese would take the east. Instead of asking the Pope to clarify the whole thing, they began to argue among themselves. So then the Portuguese started feeling shortchanged. That was the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas gave Portugal Brazil. Now, Portugal has so much territory. It has more territory than it can handle. Brazil is a subcontinent. Portugal hasn't even got the manpower to walk over Brazil, let alone rule it. Now, Portugal has to scrape the bottom of its own barrel, manpower-wise. Now, Portugal brings in to Brazil because they need white faces now with guns. It brings some Portuguese who hadn't been treated too well at home and who were very low class. And these Portuguese, they get there, see these African slaves, flush women, Indian women, their beauty, all the fauna and all the vegetation, and beautiful birds and land and forests and riches as far as the eye can see. So someone said, behold, all of this is for the mother country. The mother country hasn't done much for me. This is mine. Now you have two Portugal. You have a Portugal in Brazil. You have Portugal in Lisbon. You have something else. You have two Portuguese slave trades. You got a slave trade catering to Brazil. You got a slave trade catering to Lisbon. Literally, you've got two Portuguese colonialisms. Now, because, as I've emphasized before, for the first 150 years, very few white women were brought to the New World. The Portuguese ended up staying. He wasn't celebrated. So he asked permission for the Catholic Church to marry the African woman, and not just to shack up or have concubinage, although there was a lot of that. Legal marriage took place. The African woman insisted not only on legal status, but once married to the Portuguese man, she would be automatically free. And she began to maneuver for the freedom of her relatives or members of her respective tribe. Now, a group of free Africans began to develop. And when they moved into the hinterland, they convinced large numbers of Portuguese, that there was no way of containing these Africans, so therefore some of them had to be free. So now you have an early, basically free population, then a large number of Africans landing in Brazil, bypassed the Arctic rock, went straight to the forests and hills, and were never slaves. Now you see the origin of the number. The free African communities in Brazil, the Africans who insisted on not becoming slaves. Later, these Africans who escaped slaves, perhaps would last 110 years. And it will be democratic. In fact, that's the key to the downfall. It was democratic to white people that did not know that they were spies. Set up a government, it should be minded to study the structure of America. It's to study the imagination and the durability of the African away from home, pitting his mind against horrible circumstances. The movie Colombo is merely a kind of smattering of the truth. The character Zumbe was a real character, real life, not a fictional character. He lived. He built a state. He was a man who never read a book, wore a store shoe, assault Modern City, built a state that lasted 110 years. And that was revolutionary stamp on Brazil. So today, when you think of honor and dignity among the African people of Brazil, when you think manhood, they think of something. In this hemisphere, that hemisphere, maybe greater than the Haitian achievement is the achievement of the independent republic of Panama before the American Revolution. Long before the American Revolution, almost 100 years before the American Revolution, American First Republic knows America's First Republic. In the 1600s, these are the things that unfolded, the drama after 1600s. All right, not all of them good. 1600s in the Caribbean islands, another drama unfolded. The greatest economic exploitation is in Haiti and in Jamaica. Principally because these countries are the area where you have the most developed plantation systems in the whole of the New World. And their return and in 1/3 of the economy, it goes 1/3 of the goods, service, and the financial return that goes to Europe is coming out of Haiti and Jamaica. Now, because these are the most exploited colonies, and among the Spanish colonies, Cuba is about 1/3 of it. Now you can understand with the absentee landlords demanding more and more profit, while the slaves here are more exploited. Now, the period of Haiti is over. It's now called Haiti. It was originally called Hispaniola. The Hispaniola period is over. Father de las Casas has lived and died now. Father de las Casas came over on the third ship of Christopher Columbus. The Christopher Columbus discovered through diseases and exploitation and brooding. The Indians were dying in such wholesale manner that they had even killed our labor supply. He went to Father de las Casas and proposed the enslavement, decrease the enslavement of the African in order to save the souls of the Indians. Father de las Casas agreed and went to the Pope to get permission for the increase. Remember now, the Pope was the arbitrator of everything. we'll explain the British entry, because once the British enter, this is going to interfere with this whole thing. The Pope agreed and sent commissions to look into the disappearance of the Indians, rapidly disappearing. And many times when we went to certain islands, there wasn't one Indian now, so-called Indian. Now we know that that's not their proper name, but that's for the sake of conversation. We use the name. Now, my main point, focusing here, is that if there were anything in doubt after 1600, the doubt was over. Africa was in the tragic trap of slavery. It wasn't going to get out for the next 300 years. Europe was coming out of the Middle Ages, and it was going to come out using slavery as the economic means of coming out. They were going to use Christianity. That was going to be a focus, rationale. But they weren't going to practice none of it. In fact, some of the slave captains would profess devout Christianity, and some would even write hymns. The famous hymn, How Sweetly Sound the Name of Jesus Sound, was written by a slave captain of a slave ship, waiting off the coast of West Africa for the tide, for high tide, so he can sail away with his ship full of slaves. Now, I know it's a contradiction in all contradictions, but it's a fact also. Now, 1600, all of this is now a fact of history, and nobody's dealing with sentiment. And the church has been modified, at least the teaching has been modified to justify this criminal act. See, you're going to have to study again the life of Henry VIII. And what this man was about. He laid the foundation for the Church of England. And the Church of England put it away from Catholicism, freed England's hand, freed England from going to the Pope and asking for permission. And now, once England's hand is free, England would ask, show me the clause in Adam's will that says I'm not entitled to my share of the black gold in the back. In France, Francis of France would ask, who gave the Pope the right to give away people in kingdoms that didn't belong to him in the first place? While France, a Catholic nation, is at odds with the Catholic state, the faith. For some reason, which I'm not clear on, but it was not until the period of Cardinal Russia that France had a rationale to go into the slave trade. And we need to study this unholy rascal again. And the role of the church in furnishing a rationale for the trade. Now, France is in the business. England is in the business. The Scandinavians are in the business, and we've forgotten them. The Swedes are in the business. The Portuguese have built the most awesome and the largest of the slave fortresses, Elmina. The French have built Goring, first built by the Portuguese. They're building permanent fortifications along the coast to hold the slaves until the ships come by. They're calling these places factories. They're luxurious quarters on top of these factories, where these slave buyers and captains live in luxury. Even a separate corridor where the women they want to violate that night parade in the courtyard, and they pick out the one they want for the night, and she comes to the separate see all the trap doors, and when she's pregnant, sometimes instead of sitting on the next floor, she's kept there, and there was a United Village in and around the fort. In and around nearly every fort. And somehow, these offsprings ended up engaging in the business themselves of being clerks and collaborators in the local business. Now, in Ghana, there was a slight exception. These families grew up and nearly all became loyal Ghanaians and pledged allegiance to Ghana, their descendants. And when the German missionaries came, the Randolphs, and the Lutheran missionaries came first to Ghana, violently. And the Lutheran missionaries nearly always married into these bastardized African families. And yet, all of them, not a single one, ever turned against the African side of their family in favor of the European side of the family. Sierra Leone is a much different situation, where you have a distinct class, Creole class, that holds itself aloof and separate from the Africans. To this day, while in Ghana, they mingled, they mixed, and many of them became some of the best servants patriarchs Ghana ever had. In fact, the father of present-day Ghana, present-day politics in the 20th century, was one of them, Case the Hayford. And all of the men of that group, almost to, without any exception, married dark-complected African men. Ghana is the rare exception. There was very little of this in Nigeria. Quite a lot. Sierra Leone was literally the dumping ground for the British slaves. We'll get to that a little later. It was also the dumping ground for a lot of unwilling blacks in the United States African American Revolution, and a large number of blacks in Nova Scotia. That's some other discussion some other time. What we are trying to get to is the aftermath of 1600, and what 1600 would set in motion that would be reverberating to this very day. Patterns of slavery that will become patterns of colonialism, that will become patterns of stratification that today affects Jamaica, Sierra Leone, Barbados, other nations in the Caribbean. These patterns were set up then. It wasn't broken. All right, now, the British entry into the business really started in Venice with Henry VIII's only child. He might have had something that didn't survive. Remember the lady whose head cut off? Yeah. She did give him a child. Why you cut her head off? I don't know what others did not.
She was accused of being unfaithful.
I know that part. But at least she delivered a child. The other one didn't deliver a child. Well, he had an early version of syphilis, was the British called it gout. How they get gout out of that, I don't know. But we don't have time to discuss the fact that syphilis started in the royal family. It was once called the royal disease. And when some of the women discovered this, there was no cure at that time. They began to refuse cohabitation based on that suspicion. I thought he might, in his rage, cut one of those heads off instead of the one who had given him a child. It was Elizabeth. So so-called Virgin Queen, who are being told off the slave trade, rejected at first, and finally soon showed legends of the profits could be made if she invested some of her personal money in the trade, in the ship. The good ship Jesus. That was the name of the ship. And the coat of arms of the ship was two Africans bound back to back. And Captain Hawkins entered the ship. Then she led England into the business of slavery. And England entered the business with a vengeance. Now, where was England all this time? Remember, the business was 150 years old before England got into it. And England had been running errands with the Portuguese and Spaniards, literally delivering slaves to different ports for them. In the meantime, England had been studying the ships, studying the routes, doing what she wanted to do, and extracting the information she needed. But when England discovered something, drove the Portuguese out of West Africa. Portuguese now want to go in the Congo, subsequently, Angola, and subsequently to East Africa, concurrently being the last phase in the Congo. Now you have competition between various powers. The Scandinavians along the coast become middlemen, except the Dutch became middlemen too, the gun salesmen and the like. But if you look at a map of Europe, you can understand why the Scandinavians didn't last in the business. Although the Swedes had built Christiansborg and others had built Fort along the coast. But when they have to go home for supplies, they got to go way up at the top of Europe. When the Spaniards and Portuguese go home, they go right up the side of West Africa and they're home. So they can get supplies and soldiers quicker than other nations. So they can facilitate that business because they're in a direct line to where the business is occurring. And at first, now we're talking about two businesses now. We're talking about the development of the slave trade along the coast of West Africa. We're talking about the opening up of the New World by the Spanish conquistadors from the expropriation. Now we're ready to explain the fact that there were large numbers of Africans with the Spanish conquistadors. And these were not raw laboring Africans. And most of them did not come from Africa. Now we have to explain why so many skillful Africans were with the Spanish conquistadors. Where did they come from? They didn't come from Africa. Now, the wheat farm with Cortez, why did he had to be skillful? Literally introduce wheat farming in the hemisphere. Well, where was he planting wheat before he got here? Wasn't planting it in Africa. Not that wheat was unknown to Africa, but he wasn't doing wheat farming in Africa. And yet he was wheat farming someplace, because he was young. The first Africans enslaved, not so much enslaved, but recruited for labor with the Spanish conquistadors came from the Mediterranean Africans who had gone there with the Africans in the Arab conquest of Spain and Britain. So now the European turning on these Africans first. Once the Europeans got power, the first African he saw was the African on his side. Not the African in Africa, but the African who'd been there all along. The Moors. So there was an African army with Pizarro in Peru. I mean, this man was an expert ammunition repairer. He wasn't working in Africa. There was Alonzo Nino, Christopher Columbus's lead ship, Papa. targeting the African ships. He had experience, otherwise he wouldn't have had that job. He was probably the lead ship. I checked Spanish records, and he was a Christian African who had stayed on in Spain after the Africans lost their power. His family stayed on because they didn't have to be told when they took Catholicism and died, because they had given up Islam and already converted to Catholicism long before the Inquisition, long before they were threatened with death. They didn't have to be threatened with death. But they were Christians already. By the time this occurred, many Muslims were converted to Christians and stayed on in Spain after the Africans and Arabs lost Spain. So if you keep on, you explain Othello. Most people they can't explain Othello because they can't explain the African general, head of the European army. They can't, this is fantasy, no fantasy. No African generals head of European army because the Africans had been 800 years. European economy was depressed, the military was depressed. That was the African general that defeated El Cid. You have a hard time imagining, well, how can you imagine Africa defeated El Cid, then look at African slavery? Then how then can you imagine an African empire inside of Africa that lasted 200 years after the slave trade had started? But it happened. It's a fact, it happened. The documents are there. We have to look at the totality of things. And once you look at the totality of things, you're into contradictions. The idea is that if you got an African independent state with armies and ambassadors and communication inside Africa, and a few hundred miles away where the slave trade started, the question, why didn't he help? He go and help the other. One go and help the other. And one go drive the slave traders into the sea. It's an interesting question to ask. Then you have to know something about what kind of communication existed between that one and the other one. Then you enter a modern African and medieval African tragedy that parallels modern African tragedy. Sometimes today's communication between African states who are nation are just as bad. Now, as you get further into the 1600s, the drama is getting worse because as you move into the 1600s, the slave trade is getting worse. The 17th is going to be the worst single century of the business. And an inkling of life is going to appear in the 1800s. But yet in the midst of all of this, Africa is going to produce some valiant men, heroic men, and women too. Nzinga will be fighting the last of her wars against the Portuguese in the 1600s. Just a little after the 1600s, 1663, she will be fighting the last of these wars. And she will either win or lose, hitting her army now, this Portuguese mighty Dutch guns. This last of the great female warriors of that period who go down to defeat after fighting the Portuguese 52 of her 81 years. Since the beginning of the trade, there was no period where there was some form of mounted resistance. Some parts, several parts of Africa and in the Caribbean. Now, while all of this drama is unfolding in Africa, the Caribbean, and in South America, the first generation of Africans in the United States, in a formal sense, the first generation is just about ending. Because the blacks in the United States were late. And when they arrived, but they did not arrive until 1619. 1 year before the Mayflower. government, we're seeing the government unfold. We're also seeing some traps being set that the African is not going to get out of. He's not totally out of to this very day. In the next session, we will move into a period where his resistance will be more successful. And when slavery will reach a saturation point, meaning that everybody that want one will have one, everybody that can afford one will have one, then the system will become unwieldy. And the unwieldy nature of the system, the British will begin to get a cheap reputation for abolitionism that they do not deserve. And a whole lot of people have not examined the fact that most British abolitionists were failures. And some Americans too. Most people who would accept them, which would go for the Randall Shaw, will not examine the black abolitionists at all, who in most cases were sincere, had to be sincere, because no fakery at all could possibly be been accepted from them. But so much has been left out of history, because the truth sometimes won't catch on in history. The fakery is intriguing. That's unfortunate. I had an encounter like this in Detroit yesterday. Egyptian Africa. The African Arab media Africans out of history. I said, we left them out because sometimes they're Arabized Africans. I said, when you come under the influence of Africa, you take a whole lot of culture and techniques from Africa to when you become Africanized and you still call your achievement African. Identify the achievement you took from Africa as Arab. You have to achieve something in relationship to you.
He said something about count. I just want to hear what you got to say about the origins of that.
I don't know the origin of that, but anytime an English gentleman have a disease that the British don't want to discuss as a social disease, it just classified as gout. They don't go gentlemen don't have social diseases in England.
You had mentioned, you were talking about the free Africans not helping in the slave trade. I'm sure some of the free Africans did help in the slave trade, but not to a full extent.
No, I mean, yes, they did. But I was talking again about the Africans who had armies and organization. And if they had unity and agreement, they normally could have stopped it.
Do you know why
And
they
they thought about it too late.
was?
Communication between Africa and Africa has not been good. And because of the Pan-Africanism, there is a Western African concept that has regional unity, continental unity, eluded them. They're fighting for it now and struggling for it. And I think ultimately they're going to achieve it, or will achieve it, if they're going to survive. And I participated in the conference a few weeks ago that proved that it was hopeful, that it's a hopeful concept. Because the one thing we agreed on, that we came from all over the world, including a delegation from the South Pacific, the one thing we agreed on, that no matter where we came from in the world, that we're all Africans. We will stop calling ourselves, these blacks in the U.S., these people from the South Pacific, we're all African people wherever we are on the face of the earth. Only unanimous and you agree. We're African people wherever we are on the face of the earth.
That was my second question. Was a lot of Americans over here uniting with Africans.
Well, that I'll be meeting with some of the same group in Miami, Florida, 26th through the 28th. That is one of the reasons I'm going. Some of the finest minds in the whole African world.
Was that in Florida?
Agency said I was going to be the king from Tudors. Yes, I thought I saw him. Be glad.
The difference, the reason that the Africans who had established governments and parties and whatnot, the reason that they did not help those people who were being enslaved be the difference in the concept of slavery that they held as opposed to the type of slavery that Europeans were imposing on the Africans.
Yes, the difference between this concept. Now, when we get a little later, we will talk about Madame Tanabu, because Madame Tanabu was in the business, and she was selling slaves. And after a while, she asked, when will some of them come back? Because she thought she was recruiting people to go and labor, and once the labor was over, they would come back. And she discovered these people are not coming back. And then she turned on the business and fought to destroy the entire business all along the coast of Nigeria. And she would war on anybody else in the business, including the kings. And our last talking with the king of Abakuta. And her husband had died, and she, there was a man pursuing her hand. And she said that, I have man's work to do, and I have no time to play around with these female traits. When I finish man's work, I will consider being a woman. After she forced this king off the throne, then she turned to the man pursuing her hand, considered it, married it, and settled down in a place in Nigeria called Jos. Why Jos, I don't know. But I'm saying this is personal mainly because Jos is so hot. There's a special sun that shines and hits night.
Thank you very much. Tonight, I'm going to talk about that period which shaped the United States and made it what it is. One of the reasons you don't understand nations, you don't understand the intention in the foundation of the nation and who the nation was made for and how it was shaped. I'm going to deal with the period 1776, the American Revolution and aftermath. I'm going to end on the eve of the Civil War. This is the period when the intention of the nation was shaped to be what it is today. You have a lot of assumptions about this nation because you have not understood how it was shaped and who shaped it and what they shaped it for. All right, let's look at the American Revolution and see what the American Revolution was about. It was not about the liberation of anybody. It was a family dispute between a younger branch of English-speaking people and an older branch of English-speaking people. And the younger branch seemed to have had enough energy to win the war after almost losing the war. Now, how did the American Revolution come about? England was so involved in wars at sea, internal religious wars. England had just become a Protestant country that had not settled down. England was in turmoil and could not hold all of its outer flank colonies intact. Now, while there had already been a revolt in its black colonies, Jamaica in the outer colonies of the Caribbean. They did not have the military support to bring off a complete revolt that would free them from British domination. And besides, not being white, they did not have access to ammunition from Europe, other European nations, and did not have sympathy from other European nations, themselves slaveholders. Remember now, during the American Revolution, Lafayette came from France. Lafleur, the French architect, came later to design the city of Washington, left in a huff, and a brilliant black mathematician who was looking over his shoulders, Benjamin Banneker, remembered the plans, put them together, and really Benjamin Banneker, not Lafleur, is responsible for the design of Washington, D.C., one of the few American cities originally designed for some kind of traffic. If you look at Washington, the center of Washington, you can see the streets can take traffic. The smaller streets in these outer areas that wasn't in the original plan. So now in the shaping of the United States, let's look, the British colony that's going to become the United States. You had a series of colonies, 13 different colonies with 13 different flags, all approving of slavery. Now in the lower South, where the worst of the scum of England was dumped, out of prisoners, out of work houses, ladies of the evening and the night too. Slavery was forbidden for a while. These were debtors and prisoners and the like. What you cannot understand is that Europe dumped its human garbage can into the so-called New World. The worst of that garbage can came to the United States. We inherited the worst of Europe. Not that there were flowers other places. Now in the New England states, some of the English came to escape persecution. Some of them were people of means. Mostly in the southern states, people trying to better their condition. Large number of them were indentures. All right, I'm getting to the point, and the point is, where did we fit into all of this? What had happened to the Africans in the United States between 1619 and 1776? Let's focus on 1776, because during that period, on the eve of the revolution, there had been contact between the Caribbean freeman and the black freeman of New England. And if you look at the biography, Russ Wellum, Jamaica, Prince Hall, Barbados, Robert Campbell, Jamaica again, Peter Ogden, Antigua. If you look at the biography of all of these Caribbean people, not one called themselves a West Indian. Everyone thought of himself as an African person away from Africa, and saw the plight of one African person identical with that of other African people. All right, now the revolution comes. The alleged hero, I'm using the word advisedly, the alleged first man to give his life in the American Revolution was Christopher Adams. All right, I would not take a black hero out of history unless I got 10 to replace him. I'm going to put him in proper perspective. Christopher Adams, drinking with his Irish cut buddies, hanging out, everybody boasting about what they're going to do to the British. And he just stumbled out of the bar ahead of the rest of them. He caught a bullet and got into his world's great accidental hero. All right. Because white people say so many bad things about us, it's not true. When they say something good is not true, we might as well let it ride. Okay. Christopher Adams, of course, was one of the early casualties to the preface to the American Revolution. But as a matter of historical fact, the revolution hadn't started.
when he was killed. So to say that he was the first to die in the American Revolution is stretching a point. He did die, or let's give him all honor due him. But he didn't die in the American Revolution because there was no revolution at the time. Okay. There were other black heroes in the American Revolution, and I wouldn't take him out unless I was going to put them in. There were genuine heroes in the American Revolution. So at first, Washington didn't accept black Americans in the American Revolution. But there were several families, the Braziller Lou family, the descendants still alive, some in Chicago and some around Boston. I've actually talked to someone on the telephone and greeted those in Chicago. Because they were light complected, Washington couldn't tell where they belonged. So they fought right straight through the American Revolution. But now, the second brutal winter, Washington turned to a black friend, James Fortan. James Fortan was a tent maker and might be the first black middle class or person of considerable wealth. And he told Fortan of the difficulty of the last winter, and he looked at some of the heavy wax matted tent cloth. And he said, the tent cloth you are using is much better than the cloth in our breeches. Now, Jim, suppose you make some breeches out of that cloth, and the breeches made by James Fortan helped to save Washington's army during the second and the third, the last winters of the American Revolution. Peter Salem saved his life at one point. Near the end of the Revolution, there was an attempt to poison Washington, and Samuel Francis, who owned the tavern still exists, down around Wall Street area, was of Caribbean descent, a Caribbean free man, and his daughter Phoebe noticed the attempt to poison Washington, because that's where Washington went to eat. And she told Washington's intelligence, and that saved Washington's life. Okay, Washington took a liking to Francis. Francis, after Washington became president, and he became steward to Washington, and Francis, being a good cook and a restaurant man, began to invite people to the White House to have special food on Washington's birthday. This is the origin of Washington's birthday, by this Caribbean restaurant man. Now, because he was light complected, the assumption is that he was white. There's no proof that he was white. His daughter Phoebe seemed to have taken more from her mother's side. There wasn't much question that she belonged to us. But she saved Washington's life, and when some major tried to play up to her romantically to cover up the secret of the attempt to poison Washington, she wouldn't buy that angle. All right. Now, the second year of the war, Washington began to accept blacks in the army. And they began to distinguish themselves in a number of the battles in the American Revolution. A woman, Deborah Gannett, disguised as a man and fought in the American Revolution, a black woman, 9 months. And when they discovered her and discharged her with a pension, all this is recorded, they gave her a certificate of virtue. I'm saying that that was the worst thing they could have done for her, because her virtue wasn't even being questioned. And she didn't need the certificate. No one had thought about that one way or the other. She had to have same quarters with men and same bathing facilities with men, and for that 9 months, they said that she behaved like a lady and kept herself in a manner befitting the best of ladies. I don't know why they had to say that. They had left it alone. Nobody would have thought about it. But be that as it may. Be that as it may, this was an outstanding black woman in the American Revolution. Also of mixed parentage. Now we have to do something which we haven't done. We haven't made an assessment of Africans of mixed parentage who were great patriarchs for our cause and who went on the other side with their light complexion and brought back secrets that damn near saved us in many occasions. We have been dealing with the cop-outs so much. We haven't even dealt with those who endanger their very lives in behalf of the black side of the family. Now, there were a number of others in the American Revolution, and my main point is that we fought in this war, and having fought in the war, we got nothing out of that either. When Washington proposed to some of these families that they send someone to fight in the war, when some of these aristocratic families did not want to send one of their sons, they sent a slave instead. And they sent the slave with the promise that after the war, the slave would be free. Now, while we know so much about this, there is an almost classical book with a title that offends me a little bit called The Negro in Colonial New England by Lorenzo Turner. Now, and yet it's the best documentation on the subject. The most scholarly documentation could be Benjamin Quarles' The Negro in the American Revolution. But here you have case histories of blacks who fought in the American Revolution. It is from one of these case histories that I get the story of Manny's Sam. This black New Englander fought in the American Revolution. His master, he was a slave, his master was probably named Manny, and Sam is the only name they gave him. So he fought in the American Revolution. No doubt he endeared himself to his white comrades who taught him how to read and write while he was in the army. When he came out and they tried to re-enslave him, he took it to court. And all of the veterans who had fought with him came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and all the states around to be moral support during the trial. All he needed was moral support. But with his rough-hewed language they had taught him, now he could read and write, he petitioned the Massachusetts court for his citizenship and his right to be a free man. And his petition is a great piece of American literature that could be printed separate and distinct from the trial and read as a piece of literature. Along the same line was the work of Amos Fortune, whose life started in the American Revolution, but who continued and was a vestryman in the white church after the American Revolution. All right, we have been the people who made the first overtures to get along with other people. Now let's see what went wrong and how it went wrong. The making of the Constitution. It is now the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. Now, who made the Constitution? Who were they talking about? What were their intentions in the making of the Constitution? Now, because we dream so much, we do not understand that the American dream was never dreamed for us. The American promise was never made to us. And if you face this reality, you might understand what you have to do. Now, they're making a constitution. 52 days of deliberation in Philadelphia. They produce a 2 or 3 page document. Jefferson wants to bring up the problem of slavery. Benjamin Franklin tells him, don't open this can of peas. Jefferson, a double-dealing liar, he writes so eloquently about liberty in the Constitution. He's had liaisons with several black women and had several children by black women, Sally Hemings being the most consistent one. I think he had 7 children by her. And if you go to Monticello, the Jefferson home, I talked about this so much they closed off that stairway. There's a stairway leading from his bedroom to her bedroom. And yet Jefferson talked so much about liberty and justice and democracy, he never freed Sally Hemings, the slave woman who bore him 7 children. See, democracy for us was tainted from the beginning. Now, in the making of the Constitution, the Southern makers of the Constitution had a large non-voting constituency. Now, the Southerners were elected based on that constituency. They would not give the Southerner full credit for the slave, so they declared the slave to be 3/5 of a man. There is nothing in American literature, there is nothing in the amendments to the American Constitution that ever said you are a whole human being. Every black man, including me, who ever paid taxes, is paying taxes under false pretenses. We should never have paid any taxes because it was taxation without representation, and still is. Now, in the whole concept of 3/5 of a man, many Southerners came to office based on the fact they had so many slaves in that constituency, though non-voting. So we see now the nation is shaping itself. Now, in essence, who was the nation shaped for? And remember this, and I'll repeat it if you don't understand it. This nation was made for originally free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. And when they say in this country, liberty and justice for all, that is the all they are talking about. And they are not talking about women, they're not talking about Catholics, they are not talking about Jews. Now you can play behind and be a servant to the power of the white male Protestant, but he will always be the dominant power in the country until he acknowledged and put in law and action that this country was meant for someone else other than himself. When someone asked recently whether the Constitution still prevails, Robert Harris, a professor at Cornell, asked, I hope not. I hope it don't still prevail. I hope there's been some changes. All these amendments, they still mean what they said originally. The president means what they said originally. This debate over this judge is what they said originally. But there are non-Protestants, whites, or pseudo-whites, who many times get a leverage by supporting the Gentile establishment and by rendering a service managing us. And they endear themselves to the Gentile establishment to the extent they keep us in line. Now you see where it started. Now you can see what other ethnic groups come in and manage your community, manage your stores. But the government even give them money to assist them in doing it. And while you are not the resident entrepreneurs in your own community. Now, I believe you can take back all of this community, any community, once you're organized to do so, And once you understand the global importance of African people in the world, you could actually do it. But you're so mesmerized by other people, you assume there's something magic about running a store, marketing food, and turning wheels in clocks and mechanics. And you forget that you did it first before they had shoes or lived in houses that had windows. What people make you forget, especially what you was, and your historical memory generally controls you right now. Okay, the revolution is over. Where are we? In the South, still slaves. There's some free blacks in the South, terribly restricted. No vote, no public accommodation. There's some free blacks in New England, really, where the voice of the free blacks got heard. But among those heard the most, Prince Hall and his African Lodge, the first black Masonic order. Now blacks are beginning to organize. They're beginning to express themselves in poetry. They're beginning to express themselves in the slave narrative. They're beginning to question whether they go to the side door or the balcony of churches. Soon, Richard Allen, James Varick would challenge the white church, and they would find the AME. Now the independent black church is on the way. You've got independent thinkers now. And we are approaching the 1800s. And as we approach the 1800s, we have the semblance of a church organization, the semblance of literary organization, the semblance of a protest movement. Now, as we came into the 1800s, let's look at that first half of the 19th century. Because this, in my opinion, was the most dynamic period in the history of black America. It was the most dynamic period because these blacks were clear about what they wanted to do and what they had to do than you are right now. They didn't have a whole lot of hang-up illusions that you've got right now. They weren't thinking about integration. They were thinking about surviving as a people. In the late 90s, 1790s, a sea captain began to take blacks back to Africa using his own ships. Now, can you imagine now a sea captain with 3 ships doing trade on the sea of the world in the 1790s, and today we don't even own a decent rowboat? A master sailor with other sailors at his disposal. Now, as we came into the 1800s, more slaves escaping from the South, the birth of the slave narrative, a special kind of American literature. Finally, the Douglass School, Frederick Douglass, would begin publications. But 1800 itself, the first massive slave revolt, Gabriel Prosser in the Carolinas. Now you're beginning to see organization. Along with this kind of organization will be a different organization in the North. People are coming together. Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, the great minister Henry Highland Garnett. Poets are coming together, especially the great woman poet, Elaine Wilkins Harper, Phyllis Whitley, period. And I don't dwell on that because I'm not a great Phyllis Whitley fan. I thought she misread history itself, but be that as it may. The importance of Phyllis Whitley is that she wrote. Women wasn't writing much poetry during that period, good or bad. The fact that she wrote fair poetry, They have some atrocious lines in some of them. One that turned me off is that, I'm glad God took me from my pagan land, taught my pagan heart to understand. She didn't come from no pagan land. Africa was no pagan land. In her tribute to George Washington and some lord. Well, the fact that I'm not a Phyllis Whitley fan is established, so I can go on. But during this period, a slave on Long Island produced the first cynical poem. And the poem went, my old master promised me when he died, he set me free. Lived so long his head got bald, got out of notion of dying at all. So this is the beginning of cynicalism in black poetry. I didn't believe it. I don't believe it. All right, now, the black founding fathers as against the white founding fathers that Lerone Bennett writes about so beautifully in his work Before the Mayflower. And the thing about Lerone Bennett as against John Hope Franklin, John Hope Franklin packs in a lot of historical information, but John's writing is so dull, I didn't say it's incorrect. It turns you off. Lerone Bennett is not as scholarly as John Hope Franklin, but Lerone Bennett makes the language sing. And he don't turn you off a bit. You read pick up his book, you read the whole thing. John Hope, you go to sleep with, all these facts so packed on you, without interesting explanation. But I think in Lerone Bennett's work, Before the Mayflower, in another work called The Shaping of Black America, the first two chapters, White Servitude in the second chapter, First Generation, dealing with the first blacks to be brought to the United States. All right, now, let's look at the early period of Douglass. Let's look at the black giants, the people that Lerone Bennett called the black founding fathers. Better men, stronger men, true to democratic promise than the white founding fathers. Douglass, Allen, who founded the Independent Black Church, along with James Barrett, the founders of our large organization, Prince Hall, the role then of the Caribbean free men who came to the United States, the nationalist writings of Martin Delany, sometimes referred to as the father of black nationalism. He said that to Douglass, I'm glad God made me a black man. And Douglass, who was part white, said, I'm just glad God made me a man. All right. Now we're into the period where we're finding our voices. We're into the period when Douglass would write his famous narrative. Other slave narratives would be written. Now there's another famous slave revolt, this time in Virginia. Denmark Vesey, a black free man who had known languages. An unfortunate circumstance would literally hold up the revolt. When you study slave revolts in this country, this was the best planned slave revolt. Everything worked against it. The horses that were supposed to be in one place stampeded and wasn't in the place to take them into another place. Rain and the bridge got washed out. They couldn't contact the people on the other side. The circumstances tend to work against him. His secret keepers, while they kept the secret, they themselves couldn't connect. Yet when they caught him and tried to force a confession out of him, he told them nothing. And from his silence came the spiritual. He never said a mumbling word. In other words, he didn't give nobody's name away. Now, black expression is taking a new turn. It will take a dramatic turn 1829. Here we need to pause a little bit because this is a neglected aspect of our history. David Walker, an escaped slave who owned a second-hand clothing store and a pawn shop, began to write an appeal to the colored people of the world. Now, David Walker could well be the first Pan-Africanist in literature, not to the colored people of the United States, to the colored people of the world. And if you listen to the record that Malcolm X made last, one of them, called Message to the Grassroots, and read David Walker's appeal, David Walker was the forerunner of a Malcolm X. David Walker appealed to all blacks to take up arms against their slave master and to take your chances, because continuing in slavery was a more difficult chance than gambling with your life with the hope of freedom. Now, David Walker's appeal enhanced some people and frightened some other people. Douglass did not associate himself with the appeal, though Douglass wanted freedom and thought there were less violent means to obtain it. David Walker, owning a second-hand clothing store where many of the sailors would come and pawn their winter clothes in the fall or in the spring and pick them up in the fall, when he wrote his appeal, he would put a copy in the pockets of these sailors. And this is how the appeal got to England. Someone opened a copy and took it to an Englishman who published it. Now the appeal is becoming worldwide. And David Walker would mysteriously die soon after. Remember something that I've said repeatedly. Anytime a black man shows his people the real face of power and what to do about it in this country, he's either driven into exile, driven to suicide, or assassinated. And there is no exception. You can trace it from the death, the mysterious death of David Walker, to the death of Martin Luther King. There were some lesser known ones who died, who got killed, that didn't come to public notice. But one of three things are going to happen to you in this country if you show your people the real face of power and what to do about it. Now, so long as King was advocating nonviolence and sticking to that, he was comparatively safe. But when he engaged in sympathy for a garbage strike and began to advocate a poor people's march on Washington, uniting blacks and whites, this is the basis of political power. We're now challenging this nation in its direction. And we should have put a guard around him 24 hours a day, all sharpshooters, and somebody to watch the guards. We are people lacking in suspicion, overly trusting, nearly always the wrong people. And we treated them as guests at first. In this trait we still have. Many times we are kinder to the outsider than we are to the members of the family. This is a good trait properly used. When you want to find the strongest thing about a people, which is their concept of humanity, and that's one of the strongest things about us. The flip side of the strongest thing is also the weakest thing about you. You didn't watch who you were entertaining. You didn't watch who you were inviting to dinner. All right, the next revolt to frighten the slaveholders would be the Nat Turner Revolt, Hamilton Roads, Virginia. Also a well-planned revolt. In the Nat Turner Revolt, his secret keepers were spread across four states. And one of the secret keepers was his wife. This is why I took exception to the book Confessions of Nat Turner, because it made Nat Turner really a weakling lusting after a white woman. And there was nothing in history to prove that that was true. The scene was a violation of history. All right. Nat Turner's revolt probably caused more fear in slave owners than any other revolt. And what Nat Turner's revolt was inspired by, in part, was the revolt in Haiti. Finally, black sailors going between the United States and the Caribbean islands heard that somewhere on an island, slaves had revolted and set up a free nation. When that information got back to the United States, some blacks thought they could do the same thing. It was a different lay of land, and given the circumstances, they could not have done the same thing. The fact that they thought they could do the same thing was an act of bravery and an act of courage. In Haiti, you had a black majority. You had Haiti's everlasting hills. If you go to Haiti and Jamaica, you would wonder how anybody stayed a slave anytime. Because you can go up in those hills and you can look down, you can see what's coming up at you, but what's coming up at you can't see you. And some good rocks properly tippled down would discourage them. And there's plenty of rocks on those hills. Throw down enough big rocks, they'll change their mind. Because those hills are fortresses, and great fortresses. We didn't have that. We didn't have running space. We were on level ground too many times. We didn't have access to the forest. We couldn't get to the hills, although we were in a part of the country that had no appreciable hills. But the Nat Turner Revolt had said something to this nation about the ability of the slave to sustain a long revolt. Finally, when they captured Nat Turner, tried him, the most unique thing Nat Turner did was his bogus confession. In this confession, he told about every member of his group that he knew was dead. And he was absolutely sure he was dead, he would tell it, he'd talk about it. But if he escaped and still alive someplace, he didn't have nothing to say. When this white man who took down the confession, who hated his guts, kept pumping him for more information, asking him, are you sorry about all of this? You know how many people got killed? He kept emphasizing they were white people. And he let it be known that the consequences of a revolt, some people get killed black and white. And the man persisted. Here Nat Turner in rags, blood dripping all over him, was white tried to beat him to death before he could get the gallows up while white was building the gallows. Finally took him to the gallows, had the rope around his neck. And this white man is still pushing him for questions. Don't you think, aren't you sorry about what you did? Do you understand that you're going to die? Nat Turner bravely tilted his head and looked at the fool and said, didn't Christ die? That was the end. He just went on like a man. No weeping, no crying, no begging, nobody to spare his life at all. He said, didn't Christ die? Then they hung him. And he ain't hung no crying man. He ain't hung no man begging for his life. He gave it up for a cause. He understood that before he started, that he would have to give it up. Now, the Nat Turner Revolt brought into being large numbers of laws, black codes, all kinds of codes. Douglas's voice is stronger now. A period in black America often forgotten is emerging now. the convention period, what is called the Negro Convention Movement. We have always been and still are the meetingest people in this country. We began before slavery to call meetings. And those free blacks were calling meetings, debating things. They created a literature, they created a church. Now they've created a convention movement. Let's have a convention. Let's eat and talk. And that is what they began to do. Part of the talk was about whether we would stay here or go back to Africa. Out of this talk would come black association with the American colonization movement. The American colonization movement, stretching even into the South, mostly financed by whites. Frederick Douglass peeped their hand and said, if you whites want to give blacks free trips back to Africa, why don't you free some slaves and give them the trip? I think they would enjoy it more. Frederick Douglass saw that they were trying to get the free black out of America, especially the agitators. So Frederick Douglass, while not against people going back to Africa, was against the white-controlled colonization movement. If you understand the colonization movement and how it was organized by liberal whites and some hypocritical whites who merely wanted to use the organization as a listening post to feel the pulse of black America, if you understand that, you understand the NAACP right now. A lot of people think the NAACP started off as a black organization. When you haven't read the history. Started off as a liberal white organization and they invited blacks in on that time. And they're still mixed up based on the fact that people have a certain foundation. When you understand what is at the foundation of something, then you can understand its intent. All right. Frederick Douglass would contact John B. Russwurm, the alleged first graduate from an